Today, we are tackling a really big and, let's be honest, pretty controversial question. Drawing on the work of scholar Ahmet Kuru, we are going to explore why so many Muslim-majority countries today grapple with authoritarianism and underdevelopment. And the answer, well, it is probably not what you are thinking. Our story actually kicks off not with some dusty old book, but at a tense dinner party back in 1989. Imagine being there when a Turkish army general drops this bombshell on the author's father.
Only Protestant nations contributed to modern civilization, while Muslim nations were mere consumers.
That one comment sparked a debate that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. It's a personal moment that captures a global question. So, let's zoom out from that dinner table and put the core puzzle right here on the global stage. Why are Muslim countries less democratic and developed? It is a tough question for sure, but to really understand it, we've got to look past the easy, simple answers and dig into some deep, deep history. And look, this isn't just a hunch or some vague perception. The numbers paint a really stark picture. Around 2010, only 14% of Muslim-majority countries were electoral democracies. The world average, 60%. That's a huge gap. And you see that same pattern across the board, in income, in literacy, in education. This is the reality we need to explain. So, where do people usually point the fingers? Well, there are two main arguments that we hear all the time. But as we are about to see, when you really put them under the microscope, they kind of fall apart. On one side, you've got the argument that Islam, the religion itself, is somehow the root of the problem. And on the other side, the blame gets placed squarely on the shoulders of Western colonialism. These are the two usual suspects. But Kuru's work says, hold on, it's not that simple. See, the whole idea that Islam is inherently anti-progress just crashes into this giant historical fact. The famous historian Fernand Braudel put it best. For a huge chunk of history, we're talking 400 or 500 years, the Muslim world wasn't behind. It was way, way ahead. It was the absolute center of science, philosophy, and trade, while Europe was, well, in the Dark Ages. Okay, so what about colonialism? Now, nobody's denying its impact was devastating, but it just doesn't seem to be the whole story either. For one thing, the decline in the Muslim world started centuries before the Europeans really showed up in force. And check this out. Lots of other countries that were colonized but aren't majority Muslim have managed to democratize at a much, much higher rate. So something else has to be going on here. So, it is not simply a religion and it is not just colonialism. Then what is it? This is where we get to the absolute core of Kuru's argument. A massive turning point way back in the 11th century that basically revived the entire Muslim world. Let me introduce you to the main character in this historical drama, the Ulema-State alliance. Now what is that? It was this slow but steady merging of interests between the religious scholars, known as the ulama, and the military guys in charge. And this alliance would end up changing everything for the next 1,000 years. This timeline shows you just how dramatic the shift was. In that early golden age, scholars were fiercely independent. Get this, over 70% of them had ties to business and trade. But after the 11th century, once this alliance started to form, the ulama became dependent on the state for their jobs and their money, and this squeezed out two of the most dynamic groups in society, the independent thinkers and the merchants. And here's a wild little twist. The central idea holding this alliance together, this notion that religion and the state are twins, it wasn't even an original Islamic idea. It was actually an import, a political philosophy from the old Sasanian Persian Empire that got adopted and woven into mainstream Islamic political thought. Now, this massive internal shift didn't happen in a bubble. At the very same time the Muslim world was cementing its ultimate state alliance, Western Europe was, well, it was going in the exact opposite direction. And this set the stage for what we now call the Great Divergence. And right here, you can see the two paths just split off completely. In the Muslim world, you have this alliance between religion and military power that shoves the business and intellectual classes to the side. But in Europe, you have a struggle between the church and the state, which accidentally creates the space for an independent merchant class and universities to pop up and thrive. Alliance versus struggle, and the results were night and day. If you want to really grasp how huge the early intellectual advantage of the Muslim world was, just look at this number, 400,000 books in the Library of Cordoba alone. At that same time, the biggest libraries in all of Europe maybe had a few hundred. That's the vibrant, brilliant world that started to fade. And this divergence was then put on steroids by technology. The printing press completely transformed Europe, spreading new ideas like wildfire. But in the Ottoman Empire, the Ulema-State alliance basically resisted the press for almost 300 years. Just think about the consequences of that. It created this massive, centuries-long gap in literacy and the spread of knowledge. Okay, so this isn't just a history lesson. This alliance and the social structure it created centuries ago has left this deep, lasting legacy that is still shaping politics and economics across the Muslim world today. Now, here's something that might genuinely surprise you. You often hear that the problem is just a lack of separation between church and state. But the data shows something else. Nearly half of all Muslim-majority countries are, at least on paper, secular. This tells us the problem isn't just about religion and government. It's something deeper, something in the very class structure of society. So what takes this historical legacy and pours gasoline on it in the modern world? It's a key idea called the rentier state. This is so important. Basically, it's a country whose government lives off of wealth from natural resources like oil instead of living off of taxes from its own people. Think about it. When your government gets its money from oil wells instead of from you, that fundamental link of accountability just breaks. We've all heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. Well, the flip side is, if a state doesn't need to tax you, it doesn't really feel the pressure to represent you either. This creates this awful, vicious circle. You start with the historical legacy, weak independent business and intellectual classes. Then you pour a ton of oil money on top of that. This lets authoritarian regimes basically buy off the public with services, so they never have to rely on a dynamic private sector or, democratic accountability. The history and the modern economics just lock into each other and reinforce the whole system. Okay, we have just flown through 1,000 years of history in a few minutes. So let's bring it all home and boil this down to the absolute essential takeaways. So here it is in a nutshell. The incredible dynamism of the early Muslim world. It was powered by independent thinkers and traders. But that engine was choked off when religious and military authorities joined forces, pushing those very same groups to the sidelines. This set a course for centuries of stagnation, a historical pattern that is now kinda locked in place by the modern economics of oil. And that leaves us with one last massive question. If this explanation is right, if the root cause of these problems isn't a holy book or some foreign power, but a deep internal class structure built centuries ago, then what does it actually take to break this circle and build something better? It is a lot to think about. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about these conclusions? Thanks for digging into this with me.